All right, hello. In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about, we're going to begin introducing the idea of how to make your web pages interactive, and particularly by using Bootstrap in order to make that work. So we're not going to be learning sort of any new sets of code. We're more going to learn a new way of using Bootstrap in order to add some interactivity to your web pages. So what we'll do is we'll briefly go over what we mean by interactivity and sort of how that actually shows up in web development, and then sort of at a very high level overview. And then we'll talk about a couple specific Bootstrap components as examples for how you can add this into your web page. So when we talk about interactivity for web page, when we mean the web page is interactive, what we really mean is that the content of that page, what is currently being displayed, what the user is looking like, changes in response to some kind of user action or some kind of user input. When the user clicks on a button, what we see on the web page changes, right? If I enter something into a form, I'm seeing some behavior showing up based on that. So an interactive web page is one where you're staying on the same page, right? You haven't gone to a different website. You are on the exact same HTML page, but as you are interacting with it, as you're clicking on things, as you're dragging stuff around, as you're moving the mouse, as you're touching things, the content, what you're actually seeing, is changing. The way that most so this is distinct from, say, like a hyperlink, right? When I click on a button or I click on a link and it takes me to another web page, right? That's navigation. It's not interactivity. Interactivity means we're happening within the same page that we've started working on. So in the browser, web pages are made interactive by using a language called JavaScript. JavaScript is another programming language, right? In addition to HTML and CSS, it's an entirely other, more complex programming language. And what's used to do is it's used to write the code that tells the browser how to change what HTML or what CSS is being displayed. So the rough idea here is that when I click on a button, the JavaScript code is going to say, let's take the HTML that we were previously seeing, right, that we had loaded up and our browser was showing, and let's actually change that so that the browser is showing different HTML and therefore different content. So JavaScript is its own thing, and we'll talk about more in a little bit more in another video. But I at least want to give you the ideas of sort of explain sort of what's going on underneath the hood in terms of how Bootstrap is able to create adds an interactivity to web pages. So what Bootstrap does is that Bootstrap framework actually provides the JavaScript code that will enable you to make some things interactive. Bootstrap provides a number of interactive widgets, right? Sort of parts of a web page that lets you be able to create these sort of bits of interactivity without actually having to write any of your own JavaScript code at all. You can just add some HTML content, right? The same way we added classes to sort of add CSS, we can add some HTML attributes in order to add some interactivity, without being able to produce some of these kinds of effects without you needing to write any other JavaScript code yourself. So like if you go sort of look through Bootstrap's documentation for all their different components, they have a number of different kinds of interactive components that might work, that you might see. So we'll talk a little bit about collapses as an example, but like some kind of clear, obvious ones that I sort of find interesting is they'll do things like slideshows, right? Carousels, where I want to be able to click a button and then it'll show me a different set of content, a different image. That's the kind of thing that where you're actually changing what's being displayed in response to a user click, and Bootstrap will provide code that's lets you enable to do that kind of work. Okay, so in order to get Bootstrap working, right, in order to be able to include Bootstrap's interactivity in our web page, we have to do more than just include the CSS file, right? CSS is just styling. It tells us what things look like. If we want to be interactive, we also need to include some JavaScript. So Bootstrap will provide us that JavaScript code, right, that script, that set of instructions for how to make our page interactive, but we have to make sure to include it. So if you go to Bootstrap, sort of the homepage, you're able to find the same place that we said to include the CSS link, right? We wanted to say, here's the CSS file we want to include. There's also the second thing in the sort of the list here is what's called a script tag, SCRIPT. That's going to be our tag that we're going to use to include JavaScript. So it's kind of like a link that's used for CSS, but while links are linking in and creating a relationship to a CSS, a script tag says, here is some JavaScript code, and we actually need to run and execute that code in order to make our page interactive as we go. So in order to include Bootstrap interactivity in our page, we're going to need to include the script tag as well as the CSS tag. And you need to be careful you don't forget this. So sometimes if you try to add some levels of interactivity, if you forget to add that extra script tag, none of the interactivity is going to work because there's no code that tells it how it should work yet. All right, so just like we did with adding the link element for the CSS, we're going to copy this sort of script tag just directly from Bootstrap's website. So we're going to go copy that. And then if we go into our code here, and I'm just playing with the more or less the same Bootstrap code we used in the previous Bootstrap video, we're going to put this code, this script tag in our head section, right? In our head element, right where we put our CSS link, and we generally kind of just put it at the bottom of the head link. There's a couple other places you can put the script tag, but this tends to be the most common place for it to go. You'll notice that it's a script tag. It has a source where the source is, again, this CDN's website, but now it's leading to a file called bootstrap.bundle.min.js, which basically says that's a minified version of the JavaScript, it's the .js part, that's going to bundle up all the Bootstrap stuff together. And then it has the same kinds of integrity things that we saw in the original Bootstrap, the CSS file. All right, so once we've included that script, nothing changes about our web page, right? That doesn't do any appearance changes. That just says that now we're able to include some additional attributes, some additional properties on our HTML that will make the page interactive. So there's a bunch of these different components, as I sort of demonstrated, right? We went to our documentation and we linked to all our different components. There's a lot of these different options. I'm going to show you one as an example of kind of like the overall structure and how they work. And then from there, you can kind of go dig through the documentation to sort of find out how you want to use any particular element you're interested in. So as an example, I'm going to use what I think is my favorite and sort of the most common piece of sort of interactive widget, which is what's called a collapsible. A collapsible is basically going to be a set of content that can collapse. It can hide. You can make these things disappear. So for example, I have in my page here, I had all my cards that were representing the different courses I taught in my little homepage here. I'd like to make it so that when I click this hide all button, they all collapse. They all hide and go away. So we can go find the documentation for collapsibles, right? We can say here's there's instructions about how it works. The notice it says that it uses JavaScript plugins, right? So there's a bunch of details that you have to make sure you actually do include that JavaScript. Okay. So the actual change that's going to happen is that when I click the button, what ends up happening is that the JavaScript code is going to modify what classes, what CSS classes are being applied to different elements. So we can make it so that different element is either collapsed, not shown, or is shown, and the JavaScript button is going to allow the button to be able to change that. So what we'll be able to do, for example, is if I go to my list of course cards, right, here's my row of my course cards. If I give it this collapse property, right, the CSS styling, what that does then when I refresh my page is it makes that content get collapsed. It's getting hidden. It's not being displayed. If we open up our developer tools and we go sort of dig through and look at that content, sorry, I got some other stuff commented out from older versions, right? So here's my collapsible element. There we go. You'll notice what the collapsible doing is it's making it display none. It's saying don't show this content. Alternatively, we make it collapsible if we then also give it the show thing. So we're going to say it can be collapsed, but we're currently showing it. Then that's going to make it appear, right, where we now have the ability to have it to be sort of, it's collapsible, but it's also then currently shown. Give some room to be able to see everything again. All right, so that's our first step, right? Is that if we're going to make an element collapsible, the first thing we need to do is we want to give it this collapsing class, right? We're going to want to say, what's my initial styling of this element going to be before I click any kind of button, right? Do I want to initially be shown, right? In which case I say be collapsed, or I want to say be collapsible, right? Make it so that you were collapsed, but you're in sort of the shown version of being collapsed. How do we know what classes to use? We read through the documentation, right? It says that anything that has the collapse class, written as .collapse, hides the content. If it has .collapse, the collapse class, and it has .show, remember this is that combined selector that we saw in CSS, then that's going to show our content. Okay, once we've got that sort of that section in place to say we can now hide, this thing can now be shown or hidden just by modifying that CSS class, we can now make it so the button is able to modify this. So the way that we're going to do that is we're going to go to the button itself, right? Here's my button that I want to be able to click on in order to modify things. And we're going to give it an additional property. I'm sorry, an additional attribute. We're going to, just like it has a class attribute right now, we're going to give it another attribute, which is going to let it explain what that button does. And the name of the attribute we're going to give it is this guy, this data-bs-toggle, in given the value of collapse. All right, so I'm going to add that as an attribute. So this is going to be my bs.data.toggle is equal to collapse. And this attribute, oops, sorry, got it wrong. It's data-bs, not bs.data. So this attribute here is going to say that, tell the button says that when this button is pressed, what this button should do is this should toggle something. Toggle means like something like toggling a light switch, like flipping it on and off, right? It's going to move between two different states, shown or not shown. And the kind of toggling it's going to do is going to be a collapsing toggle, right? It's going to toggle between being collapsed and not being collapsed. This is a special keyword that Bootstrap provides. This is a particular kind of collapsing. There's other kinds of toggling as well. We can toggle things like shown, not shown, big, small. There's a couple different sort of built-in structures depending on what widget we're using in Bootstrap. Now this attribute here, data-bs-toggle, this is an example of what's called a data attribute. So in the HTML specification, right, you say here's the language of HTML that's understood by all browsers everywhere, more or less. That HTML has a limited set of attributes that you can use. You're not allowed to make up your own attributes, right? You can't just say that I want this button and I want to give this button a special attribute, which is going to be my attribute, where it's going to be, you know, that says that this attribute is a special button, right? You can't just make up extra attributes on HTML the same way you can't just make up new HTML elements. They're only part of the specification. There's only certain things allowed. The one thing, though, that HTML does let you do is it lets you add attributes that start with these 5 letters of data dash. These are what are called data attributes, and they're basically special. They're almost like custom attributes that you're allowed to make up, where they're considered valid HTML, right? The HTML like interpreter, the browser doesn't say that's a bad tag, that's a bad attribute, that doesn't mean anything, ignore it. You know, I don't know what to do with it. The browser knows that anything that starts with data, it says, oh, that's something special. I'm going to keep track of it, but I'm not going to, it's not going to change my appearance. It's not going to do any work on its own. So what we do is we want to add a custom attribute. We can use this data attribute to do that kind of work. And Bootstrap then creates their own, defines their own custom data attributes that don't do anything on their own, but when the Bootstrap's JavaScript code runs, it's going to go look at those attributes. Or the JavaScript code sees, oh, this button has a Bootstrap attribute, and so it knows to make that button do some work, right? These are attributes that are used by the JavaScript to help drive what's going on. So in this case, the attributes are called data-bs-toggle. The BS, to be clear, it stands for Bootstrap. It doesn't stand for something else, right? It's Bootstrap. So this is going to say we're going to add a toggling behavior so that when I click this button, we're saying, hey, using Bootstrap's JavaScript, you should make something collapse. All right. The next piece then is we need to add another attribute called data-bs-target, which is where we have to tell the Bootstrap code, says, okay, when you click this button, we're going to collapse something. What are we going to collapse, right? What are the things that we should be hiding? You know, the question is, are we collapsing these cards? Are we collapsing the header? Are we collapsing the button itself? What is actually getting collapsed? So in order to do that, we're going to add in a data-bs-target attribute. I'm just going to add that in here, data-bs-target. And our target attribute is going to take an ID selector for saying what element ID do we want, what element with which ID do we want to collapse. This is the same kind of behavior you used when you were creating bookmark inline hyperlinks, right? So when you're saying linking to a particular section of a page. And when we talked about that with URLs, this is the exact same idea. We're using this to say, collapse the element with this ID of collapse example in my example here. So for example, if I have my, if these are my course cards, right? This is the things that I want to collapse. I might give it an ID to be able to refer to it. So this is going to be, let's call this the course cards, right? That'll be the ID of this element. It also has a class called course cards, which is used for styling, but in this case, we're also giving an ID that we can use for interactivity. IDs are used primarily for interactivity, not for styling. And then we can say that I want my data-bs-target, right? When you click this button, you should be collapsing the thing with an ID of course cards. And with that in play, we've basically set up our Bootstrap interactivity. We've now set that now when our web page loads and we get to the script tag, that script tag is going to run some JavaScript code that's going to make it so that this button, when it gets clicked, will toggle the collapse properties, the collapse CSS styling of the course cards element. And we can then see that in play. I can click the button, hide all, and all my content hides. And because of the toggle, if I click it again, it all pops back out again. And you'll notice that Bootstrap's collapsing behaviors, right? These classes actually have some nice like animation effects, right? So when I click it, you saw how it sort of slides up and it slides back down quickly in a nice effective way. Bootstrap adds that sort of level of complexity and that sort of level of behavior in how it adds its classes and how it modifies these things together. And that's the basic idea of how you would use Bootstrap to make elements interactive. What Bootstrap lets you do is it lets you add specific attributes. Often they're going to be things like toggles, you add to buttons, and then targets are where you want to target things, and then it'll modify the classes or content of any particular element. And you can see this done in sort of more and more complex ways. So if we go look at our, I like the accordion actually, which is kind of a complex version of a dropdown. Right, an accordion does the same kind of thing, except you have multiple drop-down items where when you click one, expands that and hides the others. And again, if we look at our example code for how that works, you can see that we have a button that's an accordion style button, right? That's going to be the thing that I want to be able to click on. Right, this is accordion item 1, item 2, item 3. And that button has a toggle. Oh gosh, too far. That button has a toggle where the toggle type is collapse again. And then the target is going to be then the thing that we're actually going to collapse. And though because I've now put them inside of an accordion element, we get this kind of neat, they get this sort of accordion collapsing example instead of these other pieces. You can also get things that you can do with Bootstrap, like you can use modals. Modals are elements that they're things that when you click on a button, it makes some content like a pop-up window appear inside the browser to be able to see some other content. The way this happens is that, again, you define your modal content as HTML, right? Giving it a class modal, which indicates whether it's going to show up or not. And then you create a button whose toggle property is the modal style toggle, right? Where the modal meaning show as a modal or don't show as a modal. And again, it sort of works the same way. So we've got the same idea of creating these toggle attributes and then targets to say who we want to be able to select. You can get the same kind of behavior for nav bars. Bootstrap does provide responsive nav bars that when they're sort of like your navigation bars, but when your browser gets too small, let's get that to work, then your nav bar turns into a hamburger drop-down menu, which is really good for a lot of mobile devices if you have sort of a large navigation menu, but you want to be able to collapse it on small displays. And again, like they have a fairly complex example of how to build out this navigation kind of effect. But the important interactivity piece here is that it includes a button, and that button is a collapse button, right? It works exactly the same way as this example that I just showed, where when you click that button, we're going to collapse things. But what's going on with the nav bar is it's making it so that that button, right, this collapsing button, only appears when the web page when the page is small enough, or thinner, is when we're on, when we're not in the expanded size. Or in this case, we're taking this expanded size large. If we were small or medium or smaller, it would not be expanded. Yeah, so that's the basic idea of how we can get Bootstrap up and running, get some interactivity effects up and running. These are sort of, again, these are display interactivities, right? They're designed to make it so you can display content in slightly different ways. They're nice kind of widgets that can make it easier to navigate through a page and kind of do the kinds of things we're interested in. Right, there's an off-canvas structures that Bootstrap provides that lets you do things like create slide out bars from the side, which again is ways of being able to have some content that can show up, but it's not always there, so you're not totally bothering how the page looks. And then again, these work in more or less the same way, but in this case, you're toggling and doing an off-canvas toggle. So as long as you include the JavaScript file and you add some buttons or some elements that are going to say, let's modify how these things work. They're going to have some toggle attribute on them, a BS toggle, and they're going to then have some target that says who we want to toggle. We can produce these kinds of interactive effects. These are, again, really just display effects. They're not designed to necessarily store data. You're not using identity-based work. It's really just being like, I want to change what gets displayed without actually going to a different page. And this can be very useful for presenting content in different kind of ways, and is the kind of thing that then Bootstrap provides, and it's pretty easy to integrate without doing too much work. I'll note that things like Canvas use this all the time, right? I use the accordion style dropdowns for course schedules from Canvas a lot. These kinds of things are built in because, again, Canvas is built on top of Bootstrap. And so these are very easy ways of getting pretty neat kind of modern effects without having to add a whole bunch of code. But yeah, that's the basic idea. Again, I did show you a quick example of the nav bar to sort of see how that works. The last thing I want to note is that when we look at these examples in Bootstrap, right? If we say, like, here's a live example, and we're going to look at all of the example code to see how it works. Bootstrap will often add a lot of not extraneous, but sort of other attributes and other components that's using to make their demo look good, right? And so part of the trick often is looking through Bootstrap's documentation and figuring out which pieces are actually necessary and which pieces are not necessary. And that's going to come from a little bit from reading the instructions, reading sort of the details, but also just from maybe a little bit of trial and error. So for example, this thing here, right, this has a collapse. So we talked about that the collapse class was important, but you'll notice that inside of this is a card body, but the card isn't the important part. We don't have to have a card to collapse it. We can collapse anything we want. Similarly, you'll notice that this collapsible element also includes some ARIA attributes, an ARIA expanded and ARIA controls property. These are going to use to help screen readers and help make our page accessible so that the screen reader knows that when I click this button, I'm modifying whether something is being displayed or not displayed so that the screen reader can read out, oh, new content is now visible, and start reading out that new content. So again, these aren't required to make the interactivity piece work, but they are necessary in order to make it accessible, which again is very important as we're building out these kinds of things. So these are good tools to use. Don't go overboard from a UI perspective. Don't go a user interface perspective. Don't go overboard with adding too many of these kinds of interactive widgets. They can often make your page harder to navigate, harder to use, but they can be a nice ways of achieving particular effects. Okay. Yeah, so that's the basic idea of how you can add interactivity with Bootstrap. In the next video, we'll talk about how we can actually begin pointing out a little bit what JavaScript looks like that actually does this kind of work, so you could maybe understand how you might write your own JavaScript to do your own kinds of custom effects that might go beyond what Bootstrap does.